Sasha Alenko here. I help write and produce the Reconnect America podcast. Earlier this month, we published a fascinating conversation we had with Emily Regis, which delved into the struggles of businesses who depend on Wall Street-controlled Class 1 railroads to move their freight. Today, we are continuing our exploration of this theme by talking with a close colleague of Emily's at the Freight Rail Customer Alliance, or the FRCA. Ann Warner works on the front line of the policy fights in D.C., representing shippers and harnessing the stories that Emily shared to drive the creation and enforcement of policy to improve rail service for shippers and communities across the country. Recent years have rendered it clearer than ever that the deregulatory regime of the past 45 years has failed to protect the public's access to this critical national infrastructure. This valuable discussion offers a much-needed window into the broken promises that have underpinned this policy failure, and it explores the broad coalition and the federal legislative initiatives that are emerging in response to this situation, amidst the threat of yet further consolidation and wealth extraction at the expense of shippers and the public. Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer caught up with Ann after a panel discussion last month and asked her to share about her experience representing shippers, the contours of the present predicament, and her vision for the work ahead.
Thank you very much for the time today. I'm Ann Warner, managing partner with Ann Warner LLC. My enterprise is a federal government relations and communications consulting firm where I provide federal government relations support on supply chain issues, transportation issues, predominantly on behalf of freight rail shippers, ocean shippers, truckers, railroad data providers, and also do a little bit of work supporting public transportation authorities across the country. So this firm I started about 13 years ago. Before that, I held senior level or executive level positions for government relations with various US-based international design construction firms or environmental firms. Before that, I held similar positions for various international trade associations in transportation. I started out in this business as one of those interns on Capitol Hill during college. And after college, I came out to DC to only be in DC for 2 years. And I haven't left for almost 40 years, dating myself. So it's been very interesting. And I actually first got into transportation in the 1990s, early 1990s, when I answered an advertisement in the Washington Post looking for a transportation specialist that its members are owners and operators of international toll facilities. So that's how I entered transportation. And it was paper copy. It was the resume with a cover letter in good old snail mail. And that's how I entered transportation. And transportation has been fabulous. It's what makes us grow. It's what helps us move. It's what sustains us. So it's just been really incredible and a privilege to be in this industry, transportation, but then also to be focused on the government relations side and the communication side in terms of issue management, direct lobbying, strategic planning, how to look at government relations, how to do government relations, how it impacts your strategic thinking, how it can help you identify your brand, strengthen your brand, and at the end of the day, just making a positive difference for all that transportation touches. So it's been very enjoyable to do what I do.
It's great to hear you talk about that. And I haven't been involved in transportation spaces nearly as long as you have, but I do have to say that it's a constant learning curve and it's a pretty steep one, but it's endlessly intriguing and satisfying. And it does all feel like quite important to real life issues and real national issues and our economy, et cetera. So I share your enthusiasm for it. So Specifically, can you say a little bit more about your work with the Freight Rail Customer Alliance?
Sure. So the Freight Rail Customer Alliance, its members are utilities that utilize various energy sources to produce electricity, including coal. And in their receiving of coal, they are typically captive shippers, meaning that they're only served by one railroad. They ship unit trains and they are point to point. So those are the particular types of shippers being captive. They have very little recourse in terms of trying to deal with their rail provider when it comes to poor service or increased rates.
One of the things that's been part of my learning curve is this understanding or attempting to understand the idea of common carrier obligations. And, as I learned about that and then learned about deregulation and the Staggers Act and all of the exemptions that started to be given to various commodities to excuse the railroads from having a common carrier obligation to provide service, I early on started to sense that because coal and wheat and crude oil and some hazardous chemicals are protected by a common carrier obligation in terms of the railroads have an obligation to provide reliable service upon reliable request. My assumption was that coal shippers had it made. Coal shippers have no problem. Wheat and coal unit train users, they're the preferred customers of this industry. So they must have it easy. But it seems like that's not necessarily the case.
That's correct. So the common carrier obligation, I think, is really the nexus of what needs to be addressed in order to ensure that a railroad is meeting its common carrier obligation, and also needed to help provide more definition as to when a shipper is considering whether or not to file a common carrier complaint before the STB regarding rates or service. So as you pointed out, the common carrier obligation is basically a vague principle based on English common law, where a rail carrier has to provide reasonable service upon reasonable request. So when you are a shipper and you're either dealt with a unfavorable rate or unreliable or dissatisfaction with the service, when you're talking with your lawyers and your risk management people and your C-suite, okay, well, this is what we're experiencing, but this is what the definition is, or this is the standard that we have to demonstrate if we go before the STB to pursue a formal complaint. It's really too vague and it's really too risky for a shipper to go down that path. So then you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, the STB needs to have a clarified definition of what is the common carrier obligation. And making that even more difficult is that, let's say you have a railroad in a particular part of the country with a particular commodity, and let's say that their service is 85%. Well, all of the factors that are helping that rail carrier provide 85% service, maybe it is meeting the common carrier obligation under reasonable rate upon reasonable request. But then you look at another part of the country, another railroad, a different commodity, and their service is maybe 85%. But that service is not meeting what would be considered a common carrier obligation. So you still need to have the flexibility of the STB to determine what is common carrier obligation standard. But there has to be some criteria that the STB actually needs to consider. Now, the STB's preference is to set a precedent for what the common carrier definition is by cases actually being filed, and then the STB ruling on those particular cases. But that really hasn't happened because so few shippers are willing to go to the STB to file a common carrier rate or service complaint. And then those that have somehow they've been settled without the STB having to make a decision. So you have no precedence. So that's why many shippers have been, working for a couple Congresses now with Senator Tammy Baldwin and Senator Roger Marshall from Kansas and the Reliable Rail Service Act, which actually outlines specific criteria that the STB needs to consider when evaluating whether or not a rail carrier is meeting a common carrier obligation. But it also gives it enough flexibility to decide which criteria need to be considered for a particular railroad or a particular commodity or a particular region.
Thank you for mentioning the Reliable Rail Service Act and mentioning Congress, because I think the Surface Transportation Board doesn't always feel to me like it's very confident about its own powers and what it's capable of doing. So is the Reliable Rail Service Act, this bipartisan piece of legislation, a way of responding to that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it can be said that the STB does have authority that it doesn't fully exercise. And perhaps this is one way in one area to give the STB a little bit more clarity and a little more backing by the US Congress for shippers then to actually file a formal common carrier obligation rate or service complaint before the board. So again, it's not re-regulation. It's just really trying to give the STB better tools to provide effective oversight in today's market, which is far different than what the market was when the Staggers Act was put into place. It's just trying to provide a clarification for the STB.
Yes. And I want to get back to understanding your unique viewpoint on the post-Staggers period. But before we go there, I'd like to just go a little bit further into the Reliable Rail Service Act. And it's my understanding that members of Congress often will put together pieces of legislation like the Reliable Rail Service Act, like the All Aboard Act, et cetera, in hopes then of inserting language from such draft legislation into other vehicles like a transportation reauthorization. So for a while, I've been hearing people at the Senate say, yeah, we're going to try to get this into reauthorization. I recently heard that, one, there may not be any rail title in a transportation reauthorization. The other thing I learned was that the surface transportation authorization that happened in 2015 was an independent piece of legislation.
Correct.
And that since Staggers and maybe the ICTA, or the Interstate Commerce Termination Act, it seems to me that the role of regulating the rail spaces is split up. And that is reflected in these authorization bills, in that there may be a safety title, a rail safety title, that then gives direction to the FRA. And now there may be a rail funding title that is also targeted towards grant programs and these other aspects of rail. But that even in past transportation reauthorizations, there was not a title that was specifically targeted at the Surface Transportation Board.
Right.
Seems like we're actually asking for new, and I think in this moment, very appropriate evolution of the Surface Transportation Reauthorization. It's hard to have a name like that without including the Surface Transportation Board. But what do you think about this? Is the reauthorization process, Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill that has to be passed in 2026, I believe, is that a vehicle for something like the Reliable Rail Service Act?
So you touched upon a very important aspect of how a bill is made on Capitol Hill. So first of all, the Surface Transportation Board Reauthorization Act of 2015, that was the first authorization of the STB since it was created in the mid to late 1980s. And part of that is because in order for the STB to function, it is funded out of discretionary monies from the general fund. So in order for the STB to function, it needs an annual appropriation or an annual continuing resolution. That's all it needs. So when you look at the policies that were put in place in the Staggers Act, which pretty much set up the foundation to do two things: to rescue the US railroad industry, which it did and did so handsomely, but it was also to make sure that shippers receive reliable rail service at competitive rates, which it hasn't done over the decades since the Staggers Act. So when you look at an STB reauthorization bill, you're basically putting into place provisions that are policies that would direct the STB to do ABCD, or direct the STB to take on certain issues, or to give the STB statutory authority or take away statutory authority that it already has. So the reason why it is so difficult to get an STB reauthorization bill through is because from a funding and functioning standpoint, it's not needed. However, you have shippers that have been clamoring for new policies, for different actions that the board should take in order to provide redress and relief for shippers that are having problems. But on the flip side of the coin, you have the railroads who view any type of a reauthorization in terms of new policy initiatives as going back to re-regulation. So they constantly oppose it. And what really prompted the 2015 STB Reauthorization Act was this service crisis that happened a few years prior, especially in the agricultural community. And then you had the cold weather, and you had all of the coal that was being moved out of the Powder River Basin. So you really had a lot of service crises. And you also had the chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee at that time, Senator Thune, who was so attuned to especially agricultural issues as it relates to freight rail shipping. So you kind of had a merging of elements that helped provide a justification for a reauthorization bill. And you also had a provision in there that increased the number of board members from 3 members to 5 members. And that was also, I think, very important that all sides could agree on, that in order for the board to operate more effectively, it had to have the additional 2 people. Otherwise, they would running into all type of disclosure and Sunshine Act requirements. So they had a very difficult time communicating with each other because they were only 3 people. So that kind of was the influence of the 2015 STB Reauthorization Act. Now, what we have now is we have the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act, which is the Invest in Infrastructure Jobs Act. It's set to expire at the end of September of 2026. So that is really the funding and the policy that guide our nation's federal aid highway program. So it's federal aid highways, it's the interstates, your primary roads, your safety programs, your motor carrier programs. And it also, for the first time, included a rail title, which was predominantly Federal Railroad Administration procedures and safety procedures and grants. So given that the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Act is expiring, it's always looked as a must-to piece of legislation that has to pass. So it often is the vehicle to add other things to it. So when you're looking at a rail title, that's a perfect opportunity to put in an STB reauthorization text, perfect opportunity to put in the text of the Reliable Rail Service Act. But there are indications that perhaps certain members of the House leadership and the House T&I committee, particularly Republican, are really only interested in focusing on the rail title for safety issues and program funding, discretionary grant and formula monies. So that's kind of where where do we go from here in terms of trying to move forward on Capitol Hill policy changes for the STB?
That's interesting. It would be a shame to lose the opportunity, especially when at this moment with the largest rail merger in our history being proposed, it seems like it would be in everybody's interest to be moving the House away from that position, that reluctance, that reticence, and urge them to protect shippers at a critical moment.
It is a very critical moment. And I think what's interesting is that with this proposed rail merger between UP and NS, it's all been well reported that this merger has to meet the requirements of what are considered the new merger rules, which has never been tested. And there is in statute quite a listing of requirements that a proposed merger has to meet in order to receive approval. So that's just one set of variables, let's say. The other set of variables, which is what you're talking about, is there additional statutory authority that the STB needs to actually enforce whatever the merger is, whatever conditions are put in place during the public review and comment process. In theory, the STB does have authority to enforce conditions, but what about the difficulty in a shipper going to the board to formally contest a rate or to formally contest demurrage or detention charges? Or is it meeting the common carrier obligation? One issue that's been a concern for shippers is that over the years, more shippers have been put in a situation by the railroads to actually buy or lease their own railcar equipment. But a railroad can apply a demurrage or detention charge on a shipper for not effectively utilizing the equipment. But if a railroad is not effectively utilizing the equipment, a shipper does not have the opportunity to place a detention or demurrage charge on the railroad. So there's all these little different issues. Do we really have confidence that the STB has the authority to enforce the conditions or the elements of a merger to hold the railroad accountable for performance? So those are real questions that are starting to surface more readily, and I'm sure they'll probably continue once the application is filed and it's actually available for the public to review.
One of the things I like about being involved in rail transportation conversations is that it's an area where I just do not see a place for partisanship. I do not think it should be politicized, Republican or Democrat. I don't think that shippers are Republicans or Democrats inherently. So it concerns me that, for instance, I was listening to the confirmation hearing this morning. I know you were participating in a panel, weren't able to watch it, so I won't go into the weeds on it. But I did hear board member Schultz, when pressed, say that she serves at the pleasure of the president. And that doesn't quite jive for me in terms of the statute and the independence and the adjudicatory powers of the Surface Transportation Board. It also, to me, signals a yet more urgent need for Congress to clarify the Surface Transportation Board's role. Because if Union Pacific is making contributions to the White House ballroom and folks get a call that, hey, we don't care about these 2001 criteria, we want to see this thing go through, think this is great. That's really neither a position of Democrats or Republicans. That's a particular whim or political favor. Whereas I see BNSF Railroad, another Class 1 railroad that we also need to be holding accountable, actively opposing this merger. So maybe I'm getting a little afield here, but do you think that shippers are ready to step up their engagement with Congress to press for the Reliable Rail Service Act to be included in a reauthorization?
I think shippers are always ready to engage Congress to advance policy initiatives that shippers feel are needed in this market environment. I will say that it is very difficult for shippers to be more assertive in their education and their outreach. When you are a company that ships a finished product or receives a commodity for processing or assembly or what have you, you're viewed as a cost of doing business for that particular company. So you are directed to keep your shipping costs as low as possible, and you are directed to not have a problem. And therefore, you are not to be visible before the C-suite. So the only time a C-suite gets involved is when there is a problem. And oftentimes that's too late to affect change. So it's very difficult for a company who ships to maintain supply chain challenges, supply chain opportunities as a priority in your internal workings of your company, let alone a priority in your government affairs programs. So oftentimes shippers engage haphazardly, and when the problem has happened and it's almost too late. So you counter that with the railroads who are on Capitol Hill all the time, before the administration, all the time, all levels, the CEOs, the board members, the C-suite, executive staff, senior staff. So shippers are already at a disadvantage when it comes to education and advocacy. Now, the other reason why shippers tend to be a little bit more haphazard in their public voicing of concerns and issues is railroad retaliation.
That's right.
Yeah, and this happens all the time. It can be subtle. It cannot be felt or seen until maybe after the fact.
Yeah, and I've heard a lot about this retaliation idea, and I'd like to hear, can you provide any specific examples of retaliation, even without naming names?
Well, it can happen with difficulties in trying to negotiate a tariff rate, difficulties in your service, like, oh, we're sorry, we're not able to provide your switch 5 days a week like we agreed to. We're only going to be able to do it for 3. Oftentimes, retaliation can find a way in what we call demarketing, where it's more profitable for the rail carrier to focus its movements on a particular commodity that might generate more profit for the railroad than maybe what your commodity would generate. And in some cases, we're also seeing where, let's say you've been shipping under tariff.
Could you say what that means and how that relates to the difference between maybe common carriage and contract carriage?
When you ship under a tariff, that means there is no written contract for the rate or the type of service that a shipper is going to be receiving from the railroad. Tariff movements do fall under the jurisdiction of the Surface Transportation Board for oversight, for a shipper to have the opportunity to go seek formal redress or relief of either service or the rate or a fee, like if it's detention or demurrage. If you are a shipper that is shipping under a contract, that means that there is a written contract between the railroad and the shipper that identifies and defines the fee, the rate, the service frequency, all these different stipulations. But if you ship under a contract, that does not fall to the jurisdiction of the Surface Transportation Board. So in terms of railroad retaliation, we're also seeing where there is growing pressure among the railroads to say, okay, well, you don't like what it would be under a tariff, then why don't we go ahead and go under a contract? And then maybe the contract terms are favorable compared to a tariff, maybe in the first year, but then they steadily get worse for the shipper. And there's no way for the shipper to contest those particular provisions after you've signed it. So that's another form of railroad retaliation that can happen. And we're seeing more of that.
And obviously, it's the shippers who have the option of being under the common carrier obligation or the tariff, right? So then there's all these other shippers that do not even have that option, who are only contract carriers. We want to hear your input on a few things, obviously, but the issues have come up in our conversations about reciprocal switching And in parallel to that, the idea of addressing what are called paper barriers that limit the connecting service that a short line can provide. Those sorts of things, along with clarifying what is reasonable service under a tariff rate, as well as fairness in regards to demurrage costs. Those seem to be all the kinds of things that the Reliable Rail Service Act would help clarify. And it also, your explanation to me just reaffirmed why it's so important to clarify what is a standard of service under the tariff rate. Maybe anything that comes to mind around that before we go back and try to trace some of the history.
Right. I think it's important that I don't think any shipper or the Surface Transportation Board or the railroads want to get into a situation where you have a government entity prescribing how a company should operate. So you want to try to find the balance between what policies need to be put in place to foster competition, because a free market only works when there's competition. So what can be put in place to better help the STB facilitate or foster a competitive freight rail network? If we look at the problem through that lens, I think that could probably help us moving forward when it comes to this proposed merger application. And I think too, we also need to focus on the fact that the new rules require that the proposed merger has to enhance rail-to-rail competition. So much of what has been coming through UP in public statements, in press articles, the quarterly earnings call just recently is that UP is focusing on growing volume by making competition with truck and intermodal movements more attractive. Okay, that's not what you have to meet in order to have a merger approved. You have to show how you're going to enhance railroad to railroad competition. One way to enhance railroad to railroad competition is competitive switching. And the process that has been in place before the STB, it's too cumbersome. It's too difficult for any shipper to even think about filing a request for competitive switching, let alone get one approved. That's why many shippers, including the National Industrial Transportation League, a decade or so ago petitioned the STB to change the process to make it more approachable for shippers to seek a competitive switch. Well, that kind of was on and off, on and off, on and off with the proceedings. And then finally, when the service crisis happened several years ago, the board decided to go ahead. Well, let's change the procedures for reciprocal switching, but only tie it to inadequate service. They did that. And then the railroads filed a lawsuit against it, saying that the STB didn't have the authority to do that based on inadequate service. And then the court agreed and threw it out.
Because there's no definition of service. Adequate service is that it's kind of a catch-22, isn't it?
It's pretty much a catch-22. But then some shippers are looking at this proposed merger as an opportunity to revisit competitive switching. Okay, well, let's just say maybe we could get universal competitive switching on a merged UP-NS line. That's not going to work because you're going to have shippers who are still going to be shipping on BNSF or CSX or CN or CPKC that won't have access to such reciprocal switching opportunities. So that's not going to work either, because how can you have one railroad or shippers that ship on that one railroad to have that ability while the other shippers on the other railroads do not? So it's a whole circular problem.
Very circular problem and in need of an intervention, right? And the only people who can intervene are Congress. And so it seems pretty important that folks like you mentioned the National Industrial Transportation League, or NITLE, I've heard. And is that another of the entities that you've worked with over the years?
Yes, it is.
Wow, you have your hands in some really cool cookie jars, pots. You're engaged in a lot of cool stuff. I don't know how to say it properly.
It is fun. It's a privilege. It's fun. Yes.
Yeah, it's cool. It's really neat. I mean, it's unique. So I imagine that this coming year is going to be a very interesting year for you.
it will. I mean, this proposed rail merger affects everything. It affects rail shippers, ocean shippers, truckers, the consumer, the military. It just affects everyone. Yeah. So it'll be very interesting to see what all happens.
Right. And UP's reiterating how important your point is about the 2001 rules requiring any merger to satisfy an increase in rail to rail competition, and the contrast between the rhetoric that we're hearing from Union Pacific, which is really talking about probably a one-time improvement on some connectivity for some intermodal or other shippers who are moving by truck. And as BNSF and others have pointed out, that's really not an issue of merging or not merging. That's just an issue of interchange agreements. And what's going to happen to those folks who are shipping on BNSF and connecting with NS, or the folks who are shipping on UP and connecting with CSX, or the other railroads you mentioned? So this rail-to-rail competition piece seems like a really, really important theme to be hitting over and over again in the coming months. I know it's a little out of sequence because it probably would have been smart to ask you this question earlier on, but if you've got time to share your perspective on coming into this area of policy and the economy and witnessing post-staggers through precision scheduled railroading to whatever we're in now. What was that staggers to PSR period? Does that bring up any thoughts or stories that you think could be relevant and interesting and informative to people?
Well, I think the situation with precision scheduled railroading, I think everyone wants a more efficient railroad operation. Shippers and railroads, receivers, the consumer, etc. But the way in which PSR was implemented within the US Class 1 railroads, starting with the late Hunter Harrison with CSX, is that there was no communication with their customers. There was no dialogue as to, this is what we're thinking about doing. How would this affect you? What would you like to see? We want shippers, receivers, we want you to be a partner in helping us run a more efficient railroad. So that was the first mistake with PSR. And then the second issue is PSR should not be solely to benefit the railroad and its shareholders or Wall Street. Can you please show me where PSR, the benefits of PSR, the efficiencies of PSR has actually benefited a shipper, a captive shipper notably, but any shipper, any commodity, any part of the country? You will be hard pressed to find that. So I just think it's a reflection of PSR. It's also incumbent with this proposed merger is that why don't you just focus on servicing your existing customers better? And then you can help grow with your existing customers. And you can always be better positioned then to attract new business. And I don't necessarily think a merger is needed to identify that as a priority and to achieve it. That's kind of my overall gut reaction right now.
Yeah, it's a pretty resonant gut reaction. There's lots of growth opportunities.
Yes.
There's 1 trillion ton miles of truck freight that's moving over 500 miles in 2023. That's a lot of potential growth. You don't need to have a merger. And as we've learned through these discussions, there's a difference between what someone like Byron Porter and others would call organic growth, where you're actually getting more business, right? And inorganic growth. And this pattern of consolidation to deliver benefits to shareholders rather than shippers is certainly the example of inorganic growth. It's simultaneously pushing out demarketing customers. And as you said, show me the benefit for a shipper, especially a captive shipper, show of PSR. So I don't know that this is that important for us to go into, but Emily Regis talked about rate bundling, where shippers enter into a contract, but the contract is for multiple locations. I'm not sure I understand that phenomenon.
So Sometimes a shipper has to go from point A to point B, but maybe the route is point A, little b, big B, and then to C. So you generally contract with the rail carrier that is the initial movement. So you have no idea what that rail carrier has negotiated or is negotiating for the rest of the journey, whether it be carried out by a short line or whether it be carried out by another class one. So you have no leverage to negotiate what your rate is, because if you can even negotiate it at all, it's all based upon your dealings with that initial rail carrier. So that's an example of paper barriers. That's an example of bundling. So if there was some way, especially for tariff movement, if you as a shipper would have some idea as to what your first rail carrier is paying the short line class one for the rest of the journey, that would help give you leverage.
In the Pacific Northwest, I've been learning about wheat shipping. And if the short line, say, coming out of Lewiston, they have the line that serves the port of Lewiston, they can't actually independently give a rate to the wheat co-op for what it's going to take to get to port, because they've got to connect with an interchange with Union Pacific. And so the Union Pacific has to quote the rate. And so if Union Pacific doesn't want to do that service, it just can have a higher rate. And it really discourages that short line from being able to take that business. But I wanted to ask you, if you're concerned by what you've seen with the activist investors manipulating and changing management at railroads whenever they even just make the smallest gesture towards improving service. So we've seen it most recently at CSX, and before that we saw it at Norfolk Southern. And this kind of comes back to your point about the PSR and trying to understand for whose benefit is this. Does it concern you that Wall Street is having perhaps more influence over the quality of service for railroads than the Surface Transportation Board?
Yeah, the activist agenda has been alarming from the start. Some will argue, did that prompt PSR or did PSR prompt the activist agenda? I don't know what the answer to that is. And of course, we're not privy to all of the elements that go into a decision to remove a CEO or to remove top executive or C-suite personnel or to try to buy out board members or what have you. But I just think that when you're dealing with transportation providers, it is such an integral element of our nation's viability, survival, and international competitiveness that I really think the thought needs to be, okay, how can we move our people and our goods better and more effectively? Yes, it is incumbent upon a private sector entity to make a profit and to grow and to prosper, but does that necessarily mean record dividends to shareholders and compensation packages that are unbelievable and the golden parachutes? So I just think the old term greed needs to be considered in all of this moving forward.
Yeah. And rules of the game. I mean, it's like, who's actually paying for those stock buybacks or those dividends? When the burden is shifted to the public in more congestion costs or more wear and tear on freeways or lack of competitiveness, it's not so much an anti-market perspective. It's just asking for rules that are common and for all to have a system that works
for the public good, right?
Yeah, the public good and the national interest. It's in our national interest, right? There's the public aspects, there's our corporate competitiveness, there's a capacity of this, even the ideas of reshoring industry in the US or protecting our exports even. How do you do that if you're not getting people a way to get their product to market?
Well, and it also, when you tie in with the policy agendas that we have now, which is US manufacturing, US energy independence, products that are produced efficiently. You need a solid, effective, efficient transportation system to do all that, to support that. So transportation is a key element in the bigger picture moving forward. And hopefully it'll get there.
Hopefully it'll get there, but it definitely feels like the work that you're doing with your shippers is pretty important in the organizing. In a way, you're an organizer. I come from a different area of organizing, but in a way, you're organizing organizations. They happen to be large companies or maybe small ones or groups of them. But it does feel like you are organizing organizations and helping them understand their interests in a fair playing field.
Exactly. For shippers, yeah. Because we see it with ocean shippers. Trucking, we don't see it as much, but it's the same competition issues in ocean shipping as well, when there are only a certain number of ocean vessels and they have many marketing agreements and compacts.
Right. I remember hearing something about the price of container ocean shipping going way up, people really taking advantage of crises, whether that be the COVID, et cetera. Yeah. And do you remember a moment in the transition post Staggers to the PSR where maybe Wall Street caught the bug or started to look at rail as a place to extract more profit? Was there a transition from achieving profitability to becoming a target of the greed that you mentioned?
I don't really know, but my gut feeling tells me that when at the time of Staggers, you had about 40 Class 1 railroads. Now you have only 6, 4 of which are responsible for moving 90% of our freight rail traffic in the United States. So at some point, perhaps, maybe when it was clearly demonstrated that the freight rail industry is a consolidated market with little competition, maybe that provided the green light for them to focus on the railroad industry. That's just a gut feeling. I don't know.
Yeah, it's a messy question. I'm not sure I even understand it. And you come into this world of transportation policy from coal shippers right from the very first application that you filed, or I believe that's the story you shared. Ironically, I come into this from protesting additional coal traffic through the Pacific Northwest.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
Which I actually think is really, it's part of what I love about this is because I actually feel like I have common cause with people like yourself, shippers like Emily Regis represents. And I think that's heartening at a time when there's so much polarization. I feel like it's great to have things that are so foundational. And so I guess my last, query is to posit the possibility that maybe even coal shippers and folks who don't think they have any common cause with folks who are environmental justice advocates or public policy or climate or rail passengers, is there a possibility that more dialogue could happen so that we could start to understand each other, listen to each other, and find our areas where we can lock arms for creating an infrastructure that serves us all?
Oh, absolutely. I agree with your thought. I agree with your hypothesis that you can have such difference of opinions, but at the same time, we're all trying to achieve the same thing. And there's so much to be gained. And I just think we all need to step back, think before we speak, think before we write, and just try to understand where the other entity is coming from and reach a consensus. I mean, that's governing. That's what our nation was founded on, was governing and reaching compromise. It's not an ugly word. It's how we move forward. So hopefully we can all get to that point. And hopefully transportation is the place to start.
Right? It seems like a really rich area, a really great place to start. Well, Anne, thank you so much. You bring so much insight and experience and the interaction with the legislature and the political system. I thank you for taking the time. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.
You as well, and enjoy the rest of the fall season. I think it's pretty just about everywhere.
It is pouring down rain right here in the woods where I live, but I'm staring out at a whole forest of huckleberry bushes, and I have a penchant for huckleberry picking. But yeah, Yeah, it's good.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll be in touch.
I look forward to it. Okay, take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
That was Ann Warner, managing partner at Ann Warner LLC and spokesperson and point of contact for the Freight Rail Customer Alliance, in conversation with Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer. Thank you to Oda Proda for the theme music. You can find this show on Substack, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You may have noticed that this podcast doesn't have ads or a paywall. With your help, we can keep it that way. Pitch in and get involved by visiting solutionaryrail.org. We're not here to sell you anything. We are here to build a movement.